May 10th, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. Workers drove a golden spike into a polished wooden tie connecting the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads. Telegraph wires carried one word across the nation: done. The first Transcontinental Railroad was complete, and America would never be the same again. The story of American railroads starts way before steam engines ever existed. Back in the 1630s, England had these simple wooden tracks called wagonways. They were just grooved planks that made it easier to roll coal carts. British settlers brought this idea across the Atlantic Ocean. Then, in 1764, something interesting happened in Lewiston, New York. A British engineer named Captain John Montresor built the first gravity road in North America. This wooden track used gravity and mules to haul military supplies around Niagara Falls. The thing was super basic, but it showed people how tracks could make moving heavy stuff way easier than muddy roads ever could. The first real railroad in America came together in 1809. A Philadelphia tobacco seller named Thomas Leiper needed to move stone from his quarries to nearby wharves, about 8 miles away. He hired a surveyor named John Thomson to map out the route. This became the earliest known American survey map of a commercial rail line. Leiper finished his railroad in 1810 using horse-drawn cars on wooden rails covered with iron strips. The Leiper Railroad kept running until 1828 when they tore it apart to build a canal instead. Here's something cool though. John Thompson's son, John Edgar Thompson, later became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He donated his dad's original map to the Library of Congress in 1873. Steam power changed everything. Back in 1787, inventors were experimenting with steamboats on American rivers. But over in England, an engineer named George Stephenson perfected the steam locomotive with his 1814 engine called Blucher. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, Colonel John Stevens became America's rail pioneer. In 1815, Stevens got the first North American railroad charter for the New Jersey Railroad Company. He wanted to build a steam-powered line from Trenton to the Delaware River. Construction took forever, but in 1826, on his estate in Hoboken, Stevens showed off something amazing. He called it the steam wagon. This little locomotive chugging around a circular track at 4 miles per hour. This happened 3 years before Stephenson's famous rocket won competitions in England. The 1820s brought the first real working railroads. New York's Erie Canal had opened between 1817 and 1825, slashing freight costs dramatically. This scared merchants in Baltimore who worried about losing trade to Philadelphia and New York. So Massachusetts started the Granite Railway in Quincy in 1826, a 3-mile horse-powered line hauling granite blocks for the Bunker Hill Monument. The builders laid wooden rails with iron plates on top. These trains moved 3-ton blocks at 3 miles per hour. That railway kept operating all the way until the 1940s. Maryland's Baltimore and Ohio Railroad got its charter on February 28, 1827. This became the first true common carrier, meaning anyone could use it to ship freight or ride as a passenger. Baltimore's wealthy citizens invested $3 million to build this thing. They wanted to connect the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River, punching right through the Appalachian Mountains. By 1830, they had 14 miles open and running with horse-drawn cars. Then came Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb. This odd little locomotive weighed about 1.5 tons with a vertical boiler. In August 1830, it raced against a horse-drawn car and hit 18 miles per hour before a belt slipped. The Tom Thumb actually lost that race, but it proved steam engines could work for American railroads. South Carolina jumped in with the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company in 1827. They started the world's first scheduled steam passenger service. Their locomotive, the best friend of Charleston, was built in New York. On December 25, 1830, it hauled 50 passengers 6 miles at 15 miles per hour. This was America's first revenue steam run. By 1833, their line stretched 136 miles to Hamburg, making it the longest steam railroad in the entire world at the time. By 1830, America had under 100 miles of track total. These early lines came from private money and American creativity. The federal government was not involved yet. Investors like Thomas Leiper and the Baltimore and Ohio backers risked their own fortunes on technology nobody had proven would work. The impact spread fast, though. Cheaper transport helped mining and quarrying industries grow. By the end of the decade, 380 miles of track operated across the country. Trains started carrying United States mail for the first time in 1831. President Andrew Jackson became the first sitting president to ride the rails in 1833, traveling from Baltimore to Ellicott's Mills. The 1830s kicked off what people called railroad mania. Track mileage exploded from a few dozen miles in 1830 to 2,808 by 1840, then 9,021 by 1850, and over 30,000 by 1860. America had more railroad track than the rest of the world combined. States handed out charters left and right. By 1838, 5 New England states plus Kentucky and Indiana all had railroad lines. Investors heard promises of 10 to 15% returns and poured money into railroad bonds and stocks. This created modern corporate finance as we know it today. Baltimore and Ohio kept pushing forward despite the panic of 1837. They reached Cumberland, Maryland by 1842 and finally hit the Ohio River at Wheeling in 1852. This made them the first Eastern Railroad to break through the Appalachian Mountains. Their Mount Clair shops, opened in 1829, became America's first locomotive factory. By the 1840s, they were producing iron T-rails that lasted way longer than the old iron-strapped wooden rails. Chicago became the railroad capital of the Midwest. 11 different lines came together there by 1860, turning a swampy little village into a giant center for grain and lumber. The Illinois Central Railroad got its charter in 1851. A young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln worked for them in court cases back in 1854. Their line stretched 700 miles, and land grants along the route brought Swedish immigrants to settle the area. Southern railroads fell behind, though. Plantation owners preferred riverboats for shipping cotton, so the South ended up with broken up networks using different track widths. Technology kept improving through this period. American factories started building their own locomotives. Matthias Baldwin's Philadelphia Works built old Ironsides in 1832. The West Point Foundry's DeWitt Clinton hauled passengers on the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad starting in 1831. Track gauges were all over the place at first. The North used 4 feet 8.5 inches, while the South used 5 feet. The Pacific Railway Act of 1863 finally made the 4 feet 8.5 inch gauge standard for transcontinental lines. Refrigerated railroad cars appeared in 1851, shipping butter from Ogdensburg, New York to Boston. This completely changed how people moved food that could spoil. Tank cars came along in 1865, carrying oil and setting up the petroleum industry. The economic effects were massive. Railroads cut freight rates by 90%, from 10 to 20 cents per ton mile by wagon down to 1 or 2 cents by rail. Midwestern farms that used to be too far from markets suddenly became profitable. By 1890, 80% of Corn Belt farms were within 5 miles of a railroad track. Cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati boomed as new transportation hubs, replacing canals that froze over every winter. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 showed just how important railroads had become. The North had 22,000 miles of track, while the South only had 9,000. This gave Union forces huge advantages in moving troops and supplies. Engineer Herman Haupt became Lincoln's railroad general, rebuilding destroyed bridges overnight. The United States military railroads repaired 20,000 feet of damaged track every single week. Confederate forces tried railroad raids. Meanwhile, Sherman's troops were twisting captured rails into bent shapes people called Sherman's neckties. When the war ended, railroads helped carry freed workers north to factory jobs. President Lincoln pushed through the Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864. These laws gave 129 million acres of land grants plus $64 million in bonds to build a transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific built west from Omaha, while the Central Pacific built east from Sacramento. 10,000 workers tackled this job. About 90% of Central Pacific's workers were Chinese immigrants, while the Union Pacific used mostly Irish laborers. They blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada mountains using nitroglycerin, dealing with avalanches and disease. On May 10, 1869, Stanford drove the golden spike that connected both lines. Coast-to-coast travel dropped from 6 months to 7 days at 1/10 the previous cost. By 1890, railroads handled 5 times more freight than waterways. The American West transformed from empty territory into land filled with ranches, mines, and homesteads. The Gilded Age saw railroad mileage surge from 52,922 in 1870 to 93,267 by 1880 and 163,597 by 1890. Powerful businessmen controlled these growing empires. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made his fortune in steamboats, grabbed the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1863, then the New York Central in 1867. He built a 1,000-mile network from New York to Buffalo. Jay Gould manipulated Erie Railroad stocks in 1868, bribing legislators to issue $7 million in watered stock. James J. Hill built the Great Northern without any government help, stretching from Minnesota to Seattle by 1889. Companies merged like crazy. By 1890, small lines had combined into 20 major trunk lines. Wall Street financed these deals. Transcontinental routes multiplied with the Northern Pacific in 1883, Santa Fe in 1885, and Southern Pacific. The gauge problem finally got fixed in 1886. Southern railroads converted all their 5-foot tracks to standard gauge in just 48 hours. Steel rails replaced iron rails, lasting 10 times longer. Continuous welded rail eliminated the famous clickety-clack sound. Pullman sleeping cars and dining cars made travel comfortable and even glamorous. In 1893, the New York Central number 999 locomotive hit 112.5 miles per hour, setting a speed record for steam engines that held for years. Railroads transformed the economy completely. Chicago's Union Stockyards shipped 4 million hogs every year. Western mines flooded eastern factories with ore. By 1900, railroads employed 1 million workers, more than any other industry. But problems came with this growth. The Panic of 1873 bankrupted 89 out of 364 railroads, leaving 18% of tracks unused. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 started on July 16th in Martinsburg, West Virginia, over wage cuts at the Baltimore and Ohio. It spread to Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis, involving 100,000 workers, destroying $40 million in property and killing 100 people before federal troops ended it. The Pullman Strike of 1894 saw Eugene Debs' American Railway Union fight against George Pullman's wage cuts. It stopped mail delivery across the country. President Cleveland got an injunction and Debs went to jail. Public anger over unfair railroad practices led to the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission. This became America's first federal regulatory agency. President Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting broke up railroad monopolies, starting with the Northern Securities case in 1904. The 1910s brought the golden age of railroads. By 1916, America had 254,037 miles of track, carrying all interstate freight and 1 billion passengers every year. World War I tested this system hard. Rails moved 97% of troops and 95% of war materials. But congestion clogged the terminals. President Wilson took control of the railroads on December 26, 1917, creating the United States Railroad Administration. Director William McAdoo standardized equipment and boosted efficiency. They built 1,930 identical locomotives during the war. The 1920s brought streamlined trains. The Burlington Zephyr zoomed from Chicago to Denver at 100 miles per hour in 1934, looking like Art Deco masterpieces with onboard radios. But automobiles and trucks, helped by federally funded highways, started eating into railroad business. Passenger miles crashed from 34 billion in 1929 to 450 million by 1940. The Great Depression hit railroads brutally. Revenues dropped by half to $1.5 billion by 1933. 70,000 miles of track went into receivership. 75 major railroads failed. World War II brought railroads back to life. They hauled twice the volume of World War I, moving 90% of military freight. Peak year 1944 saw 112 million tons moved. Women worked as track workers, keeping lines running. After the war, $2 billion worth of diesel locomotives modernized the fleets. The last steam locomotive retired in 1957. Peace brought new challenges, though. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 poured $425 billion in today's money into roads. Airlines, with government-funded control towers, took over long-distance travel. Truckers undercut railroad prices on short hauls. By 1950, mileage had shrunk to 193,346. Employment dropped from 1.22 million in 1945 to half that number. The 1960s and 1970s brought disaster. Penn Central's 1968 merger combined the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central into a 20,000-mile giant. Bad management and strangling regulations bankrupted it on June 21, 1970. This was the largest corporate failure in American history at $3.2 billion. 6 more major railroads collapsed soon after. Congress stepped in. The Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970 created Amtrak on May 1, 1971. This government-supported company took over intercity passenger routes. The Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1973 created Conrail from 6 bankrupt railroads, pouring $2.1 billion federal dollars into 17,000 miles of track. Conrail turned profitable by 1981 and went private in 1987 through a $1.9 billion public offering, the largest in American history at that time. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980 changed everything. It cut Interstate Commerce Commission rules, letting railroads set 80% of their rates freely and abandon unprofitable lines quickly. Industry historians say it saved American railroads. Since then, railroads have invested $760 billion and prevented 213,000 accidents. Mergers reshaped the industry. Chessie System and Seaboard Coastline formed CSX in 1980. Norfolk and Western joined Southern Railway to create Norfolk Southern in 1982. Today, 7 major Class I railroads control 92% of the 138,477 miles of American track, generating $66 billion in revenue. Freight business thrives. Intermodal shipping, moving containers between ships, trains, and trucks, passed coal as the top earner in 2012. Safety improved dramatically with positive train control technology now covering 60,000 miles, preventing collisions automatically. Accident rates dropped 80% since 1980. Passenger service shows some hope. Amtrak set records with 737,537 riders during Thanksgiving 2012. The 2021 Infrastructure Act put $16 billion toward Hudson River Tunnel upgrades. California's high-speed rail project aims to connect Los Angeles and San Francisco by 2033, though costs have ballooned to $98 billion. American railroads now contribute $233.4 billion to economic output and support 750,000 jobs. Railroads shaped America in ways few things ever have. Land grants totaling 180 million acres populated the entire West. Manufacturing grew 400% between 1860 and 1900. Millions of workers found employment, including women during World War II. Railroads appear throughout American culture, from folk songs about Casey Jones to classic Hollywood films. They pay $1.4 billion in taxes yearly. New federal investment promises better rural access and urban transportation options.